Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Do not forget, Preterist Pilgrim Weekend, July the 11th through the 13th, right here in Ardmore, Oklahoma. And I've mentioned this before. I want to tell you what, folks, you absolutely do not want to miss Friday night. We've got something so incredible, so wonderful, so powerful. You just have to be here. Okay? All right. I'm sharing with you thoughts on Matthew 24 and 25, the Olivet Discourse. Jesus predicted the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. The disciples asked, "When shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your parousia and the end of the age?" Now, we are told repeatedly that the end of the age is the end of the current Christian age. Really? Don't forget, the Christian age has no end. Folks, you know, if you get that one single profound thought down, you destroy all futurist eschatologies. The Christian age has no end. Therefore, the disciples were not asking about the end of the Christian age. Just that simple. Okay. But in response to the disciples' questions about signs, Jesus told them about the coming wars, rumors of wars, famines, pestilence, earthquake, nation rising against nation, etc. But he also said, they will deliver you up to tribulation. And he said all of that whole complex of events was the beginning of the birth pangs. Now, I've been sharing with you over the last few weeks this motif of the birth pangs of Messiah. This is a thoroughly Jewish concept taken directly from the Old Testament. It is the idea that in the last days, the last generation, before the coming of the Lord, before the judgment, before the resurrection, and before the kingdom, there would be a time of distress that was intended for the purification of the elect saints so that they could enter into the kingdom at the resurrection. Now, tomorrow's video will touch this concept of purification to enter the kingdom. This morning's focus is simply on 1 Peter, to follow up from last Thursday, to show you that Peter believed that anticipated end, that end after the suffering that they were then enduring. 1 Peter chapter 1, 5 and following, they were enduring tribulation, but they only had to endure for a little while before the revelation of Jesus Christ in glory and in power. Well, let's follow up on that with 1 Peter chapter 4. And don't forget, tomorrow's video, we're going to deal with this motif that in the last days, just as Malachi foretold, Malachi chapter 3, God's saints would be purified so that they could then enter the kingdom, that they could then offer acceptable sacrifices unto God in the Messianic kingdom. You don't want to miss tomorrow, by the way. Okay, 1 Peter chapter 4. This motif of then present suffering leading to imminent vindication, imminent relief at the day of the Lord is so powerfully expressed in 1 Peter chapter 4. Peter reminds them, "Forasmuch then as Christ has suffered for us in the flesh, so likewise arm yourselves with the same mind. For the one who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin." So you see, here they are. They're experiencing that suffering, that tribulation. He reminds them of their former life, of living a life of debauchery. And he says, you know, those that you once ran with, they think it's strange that you no longer run with them to the same excess of rioting and wantonness, but they shall give an account to the one, Christ, who is ready to judge the living and the dead. Now, the word ready there is from hitoimos. And as Alfred's Greek Testament says, the Greek reader would have understood the imminent judge. In other words, the judgment of the living and the dead was imminent. Now, even the most ardent futurist will admit that the time of the judgment of the living and the dead is the time of the resurrection. It's the time of the coming of the Lord. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1. I charge thee therefore before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who is about to judge the living and the dead at his appearing and the judgment. Everyone agrees with that. And then they turn right around, and then we talk about the last days, or the last day, which is supposedly the last day of time. Oh, wait a minute. Peter said the judgment of the living and the dead was ready. That Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead. But he didn't stop there. Verse 7, the end of all things has drawn near. Has drawn near is the translation of the Greek perfect tense. That which was once not near, that which was not at hand and coming soon, the end of all things has drawn near. Now, let me ask you a question. Is the judgment of the living and the dead the time of the end of all things? Of course. Is the end of all things the time of the judgment and the kingdom? Of course it is. Is the end of all things the time of the resurrection? Of course it is. And Peter said, the end of all things has drawn near. But he didn't stop there. But look, we've got verse 5. Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead. That's the judgment. That's the kingdom. That's the resurrection. The end of all things has drawn near. The end of all things is the time of the judgment of the living and the dead, the resurrection, the judgment, the kingdom. Oh, but wait. Then in verse 17, that same apostle says, it's literally the time. It is ho kairos, the appointed time. Well, isn't the last day the appointed time? Of course it is. Isn't the appointed time the time in which God has appointed a day in which He was about to judge the living and the dead? Acts 17, 30 and 31? Yes, it is. But watch. The appointed time for the judgment. Not judgment. It's not simply judgment. No, it is the time, literally the appointed time, has come for the judgment. Well, isn't the time of the judgment the time of the judgment of the living and the dead of verse 5? Of course it is. Isn't it the end of all things of verse 7? Of course it is. Now let me drive that home. When Peter uses the term the judgment, he uses the definite article. And he uses what is known as the anaphoric article. Now Daniel Wallace, in his massive Greek grammar, says the anaphoric article is by far the preponderant use of the definite article. What does anaphoric mean? It means that a writer or a speaker would introduce a subject. The subject may not have a definite article. Later, in discussing that subject, he would then use the definite article to refer back to the subject that he had earlier introduced. Here's what that means. When Peter said, the time has come for the judgment, he is referring back to verse 5, the judgment of the living and the dead, which is the judgment on the last day. And Peter said, the time has come for the judgment, which means the time has come for the judgment of the living and the dead. Now, folks, that means since those people at that time were being persecuted as part of the birth pangs of Messiah, and since Peter said that the judgment of the living and the dead, the time had come for that judgment, since that judgment is the resurrection, the judgment, the kingdom, the parousia, at the end of all things. And Peter said, the time has come. That means that Matthew 24 cannot be divided into two subjects. That means that Jesus was not talking about the fall of Jerusalem versus the, quote, end of the Christian age, unquote, which has no end. Do you catch the power of 1 Peter chapter 4? I have made this argument in one public debate after another. I have not yet received a single refutation. It cannot be denied. And so when people say, as Sam Frost did in his recent debate with Michael Miano, oh, it's the last day. Your resurrection is on the last day. Everybody knows what the last day is. No, once again, you don't know what the last day is unless and until you totally ignore or distort the biblical testimony. Peter said, Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead. The end of all things has drawn near, and the appointed time for the judgment of the living and the dead, had arrived. There is no last day of the Christian age. And I'm going to show you in tomorrow's video how Peter continues this motif of the birth pangs of Messiah, leading directly to the Messianic kingdom, the Messianic temple, and thus the day of resurrection and the judgment. You don't want to miss it. I will see you on the flip side.